A new tax treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates is incentivizing business development between the countries after they normalized relations last year. Now, Israel's finance minister, Israel Katz, said that it provides certainty and favorable conditions for business activity and will strengthen economic ties with the UAE. And for more now, I am joined by Sally Hadad Ghelibter from i24 Al-Makayas Cohen Tax Solutions. Sally, first off, thank you for joining us. Can you explain to us, please, what a tax treaty actually is? What does it mean to sign a tax treaty?
Yeah, of course. So first, thank you for having me. A tax treaty is a bilateral agreement between two countries which set rules for the right to tax individuals and companies who derive income sourced outside of the residency country, and to determine individuals or companies' residency in case both parties to a tax treaty assert they are considered as a tax resident with respect to them. Usually, a tax treaty covers income tax, company tax, capital gains, withholding tax rates, and the conditions under which permanent establishment exists. Another impact of a tax treaty is the way in which the tax authorities treat the investments of their tax residents in the other country, and the reporting obligations that apply in respect of those investments.
Okay, and what can you tell us about this particular treaty between the UAE and Israel? Because we know a lot about the announcement, but we don't actually know about what it involves. Can you shed some light?
Yes, of course. So the tax treaty between Israel and the UAE is unique in three main areas. One is the term resident of a contracting state, which is unique in the case of the UAE definition. The second is the specific reference to entities defined as pension plans and as qualified government entity. And the third is the relatively low withholding tax rates. For example, no withholding tax with respect to dividend distribution from Israeli company to an UAE pension plan and the UAE government, which holds less than 5% of the capital of the Israeli company distributing the dividends. Otherwise, only a 5% or a 50% withholding tax rate apply, depends on the circumstances of the specific case. A second example is in the case of interest, no withholding tax with respect to interest income arising in Israel and paid to a UAE pension plan or the UAE government. Nevertheless, if those entities hold at least 50% of the Israeli company paying the interest, the withholding tax shall be 5%. In all other cases, the withholding tax rate shall be 10%.
Okay, and Sally, is there any implications, any possible implications that might evolve from this treaty?
Yes, of course. So as we understand, the UAE does not apply withholding tax on payments to foreign residents. Hence, we expect that Israeli residents will not suffer withholding tax rates on payment from the UAE deriving from dividends, interest, and royalties. Therefore, in general, there should not be tax implications on Israeli tax residents. Moreover, an Israeli individual relocating to the UAE will not be entitled to tax benefits of the tax treaty for at least 5 years after his relocation to the UAE. From the other side, we assume that the reduced tax rates were determined in order to encourage UAE government entities, pension plans, and private companies to invest in Israel and preserve the low tax rates that they are subject to. For example, today, the withholding tax rate upon dividend distribution from an Israeli company to an UAE government is 25% or 30%, it depends on the case, while according to the treaty, the withholding tax rate will be 0 or 5% only.
Okay, and Sally, just very briefly, I understand that you're going to be heading to Dubai for the upcoming Women in Business conference. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so my colleague and I are participating in a Summit Experts Women in Business conference, which will take place for the first time in Dubai this month. More than 250 inspiring businesswomen from Israel and from the UAE will participate in this conference, which will engage mainly in the changes and opportunities in the post-COVID business world. And I'm looking forward to this conference.
I'm sure it'll be an amazing experience. Sally Hadad Ghelibter from the i24 Cohen Tax Solutions. Thank you so much for joining us.